All right, you know what it is. It's the Big Douglas Show. We are streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. We do this every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So make sure you hop in the comments and tell us what you think. Today is another Scouting Notebook edition, and for that, we bring on Matt Waldman. Matt, thank you so much for hopping on with us today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
It is about time for the release of the rookie scouting portfolio. Correct me if I'm wrong, 17 years for the project.
Yeah, it's in year 17, and you get a pre-draft, you get a post-draft. Also, I do projections for fantasy players as a separate product, but this is according to recruiting directors that I know, including some in Division One. This is one of the two most looked at pieces of work by scouts for cross-checking devices that's available in the public right now. So been doing it a while, proud of that. And, focuses mainly on skill positions, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end.
Tell us briefly kind of the process, how you get into a particular player, how much time you spend on them, maybe how many different games you're trying to dive into when you do it.
Sure.
Yeah.
My background is from process management way back in the day when I was an operations manager. And so a lot of what I do, everything is defined. I have a glossary for my readers. Really, my readers, if they want to learn how to study tape the way I do it, I show them exactly how they do it. It's about the time that they want to put in to actually do that is the big issue. But I define everything in writing. I have weighted scoring for each position. And that criteria is based on best practices from processes that I learned back in the day that were known as best practices that I had to get trained in and certified in, and applied it to scouting. So I'll watch anywhere between 4 to 8 games of a player, sometimes more. The criteria, you can find at least samples of, say, my wide receiver checklist that I use. I use 2 different types of grading. I use a checklist grade that's on a 100-point scale that's very intuitive. And then I use a more of a tier-based grading. And the checklist scale is more of, I call it breadth of talent, which is all the things you could do. Like if you looked at a resume for someone applied for a job, you could look and say, here's all the different things that they showed that they can do within their role in the industry. Depth of talent is more about how well they do those things. That's also on a 100-point scale. So I can give you kind of a cross section of that player and tell you, okay, here's in the various ways that he can fit, but he may never be great at any one thing or any system that he's in. But here's a player who may not fit all systems, but if you take, David Johnson, the running back out of Northern Iowa, and put him in a gap scheme, he could be a Pro Bowl caliber talent. Things like that I look at. I provide all of that information. I walk people through the process of how I arrive at those scores, and then give people basically a very detailed profile on each of these criteria that I look at. So I'll study players, and I'm pretty much, like most people who scout this game, it's a day-long process to watch a player. And I may spend 18, 20 hours some days watching 2 to 3 players all year.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it. Let's start with the most important position on the field, and that's the quarterbacks. Washington will be looking for one next year if they can't get something done via trade and free agency. Let's start with who I think the fan base feels is first in line, and that's Kenny Pickett. Tell me kind of what you see when you see Kenny Pickett. I've heard Derek Carr comparisons. I'm not sure why that's a knock, but where do you see him? And I'm curious where you see these quarterbacks compared to maybe some of that came out last year.
Well, Kenny Pickett is probably going to be my top graded guy, but not by very much. And if you look at previous years, most likely he will be slightly above my 6th rated quarterback, who was Zach Wilson. And I actually had Davis Mills above Zach Wilson last year. I was kind of an outlier there, along with Mac Jones being my number 3 quarterback ahead of, where most people had him. So when I look at Pickett, certainly has the arm strength you're looking for. He's mobile. He has all the tools that NFL GMs like, the safe bullet points to really feel like they can cover their assets when they pick a player. Okay. But here's the real deal comes down, and my theory has always been this. And I just had this conversation on Twitter with a former scout who played quarterback, and he and I were in total lockstep agreement. It really comes down to like 3 to 5 plays and how fast you process information and how confident you are. You can process information on a whiteboard and pass all the interview tests and look smart as a whip. But when it comes time, do you see the coverage the way you're supposed to see it when the bullets are flying? And can you have the confidence to let that ball rip at the moment that you need to? And when you look at Kenny Pickett, my biggest concern with him is that in the key moments late in games, what I've seen repeatedly is that where he shows that appropriate amount of daring for the first 3.5 quarters, late in the game under pressure, he makes uncharacteristic mistakes. He has, even in games where he's won, I watched, against Virginia, where he won on a walk-off touchdown. Well, it was a 3rd and 5, and he literally threw that ball with placement where the receiver had to steal the ball out of the hands of the defender cutting it off. Like, he'll show great placement where it needs to be 3.5 quarters, but for some reason, when he makes a mistake, it ends up compounding. Like the next play, now he's throwing a bad pass. So he's a type of player that when I watch him, in addition to that, pressure is an issue with him, where he can move away from pressure, but managing pressure, understanding that when defenders are coming open and they are unblocked and they have a good 4 to 5 steps to go before they get him. They have a runway, and he sees that right away. He overreacts to that and tries to leave the pocket rather than baiting them within a step or two, which the best quarterbacks in the pocket do. So that, because you maximize separation when you have a defender only with 1 step from you, because they've fully committed to that angle now. If you leave earlier, they can change up their angle too. And so he ends up creating more pressure than he needs to. I haven't seen him climb the pocket like Baker Mayfield, who was known as mobile, but wasn't really a maneuverable manager of a player. There's a lot of mobility, and he can throw on the move and may throw on the move better than Baker Mayfield can. But managing that pocket so that he can, really create time and make the best decisions available and give his receivers real options to continue to work their routes, that's something he's going to have to work on.
Now, Nate, I know it concerns you that he really didn't get that kind of production till the end. Matt, do things like that concern you?
I'm not a big guy on production either way, because what I found is it's a good odds-based way of evaluating a player. Odds are, if they're productive, in the history of looking at players all across the history of the NFL, then you can say if they're productive, then they're most likely to be good. But it doesn't really focus on traits. And when you're looking at traits of a player, production compares all sorts of traits of players. So it can be kind of a misleading thing. So for me, it's more about scouting. To me, on film is about what does the player do technically, conceptually, physically, and intuitively to create positive outcomes. And positive outcomes are not necessarily stats or wins, but positive plays, either setting up their teammates for positive plays or doing something directly positive on their own. And then that way you can filter out all the production and all the bells and whistles and just get to the idea of the guy can have a 150-yard game and 3 interceptions and no touchdowns, and you can still grade him high because you can filter out the fact that 3 receivers tipped balls that were dead onto their hands and were returned for touchdowns. And he had 1 offensive line that basically could bench press what who could outlift anybody but 1 guy on maybe the opposite team. I've seen like Matt Forte in a situation like that at Tulane, where LSU's defense, literally their whole defense, could out bench press everybody but 1 player on the team. actually. And Matt Forte only averaged like 1.8 yards per carry and still graded out strong, because if you're looking at it from that perspective, it's fine. So the production for me isn't as big of a deal for him. It's just more about what are the things that he can do to set up production. And I think he can be a productive NFL quarterback, but can he be that franchise guy that every team covets? I think he's closer to, I think Jay Cutler was a time, there was a time when Jay Cutler was a really good prospect, but you can talk about, there's ways we could talk about how he kind of got ruined in some respects. He has kind of that Jay Cutler upside, but he also has a little bit of that Drew Lock downside. And in the middle range of that might be a Jimmy Garoppolo. You might need a ton of talent around him for him to be really good.
Does Malik Willis, do you see him as having the highest ceiling of any of the quarterbacks in the class? I've heard that frequently here as we're prepping for the draft.
And that makes total sense from the perspective that most people have, because they look at athletic ability and arm talent. And those are big bell and whistle items, and they're important. But the thing is you just need a baseline of each of those, according to what the NFL standard is. Jimmy Garoppolo has those baselines. And he, it's the decision making that's the problem with him at the end of games. Or Alex Smith, who was certainly a good quarterback in many respects, but again, at the end of games, when those throws were there and he's reading the leverage and he knows the receiver's going to break open, but he doesn't have the confidence to let it go because he's a high-end academic type of quarterback. But when it comes to that feel of going, I got to rip it right here and have the confidence to do it, that came late in his career at best. So Willis is a guy who scrambles, who runs really well, who throws great, but he doesn't scramble, not to the true definition of the word. If you're going to talk about buying time to set up your receivers to make throws to get them open, he doesn't do that as well as it may seem to people. What he does well is buy time to maybe run and then squeeze a ball into places that maybe he shouldn't. So he has to learn the management aspect of it. But if he can do that, the exception to the rule who's been able to do that thus far has been Josh Allen. Josh Allen was the major exception to this rule. And if a team can manage him like Josh Allen and work to his strengths, and he can prove to be the worker Josh Allen was, and be able to do it. And most quarterbacks do it on their own. It's all nice to say, we're going to hire a good quarterback coach, or we have an offensive friendly coach. But at the end of the day, who's the guy that's going to work at his craft and do the smallest details at 4:00 in the morning every day after you've had your butt kicked on Sunday, and continue to do it when the radio and the fans and folks like you and I are talking about them in a negative fashion? Are they going to continue to get incrementally better? And that's the big question with him. So the odds are against him, but the physical skills, the physical skills are the highest in the class. But to pick up the most important part's the conceptual part, and all the top prospects have the physical skills that get people excited. He just has them in even higher order.
One last one before Nate's going to take us into the receivers, but Matt Corral, is that a product of a system? What do we look for in a guy that obviously was in a system that really played to his advantages?
Yeah, and he certainly did, because you have, just like Mayfield and just like a lot of these quarterbacks in the spread, even a guy like Kyler Murray, there are a lot of plays where they manipulate the coverage by him dropping back, looking in one direction, using a zone read and throwing in the opposite. And that opposite isn't the second read. It just looks like one to the untrained eye when it's really the first read. So he had a lot of these schemed plays. But at the same time, if you watch him this year, especially this year, he did a really strong job of reading the full field in certain moments, and showing that he could manipulate. He also did a great job off script. He's someone that I think has a tremendous feel for pursuit from defenders, to where he can buy time and make one step where he's sliding to the outside, maybe rolling to his left, a defender's hot on his heels, and he knows how to stop and just take a step back, have the defender overrun them, and he has the technical skill to be able to reset and fire the ball 40, 50 yards downfield pinpoint. So this is someone who I think has a lot to offer. He is probably the best traits plate-based player overall of the quarterbacks in this class in terms of the techniques, in terms of understanding certain concepts. He may not be advanced with his decision-making because he hasn't had to run a system that is as complex as what the NFL will ask him to do, but he shows a lot of the baseline traits you want to develop along those lines. So I think as a decision maker, he's one of the strongest in this class from a level of teaching him upward as opposed to trying to untangle mistakes and then start at ground zero. It's more with
him. Is he your favorite of the group?
He's probably at this point, and I still have another round of things to watch, but I would say he's one of my 2 to 3 favorites, and very likely at this point he's rated my number 2 guy, but there's still, like I said, a good bit to watch. He's not far behind Pickett in this particular class. So while I don't think this is the strongest class compared to other ones we've seen, he's someone that I like the mobility, the arm strength, I've seen him make mistakes, but he doesn't compound those mistakes. He's had some bad games here and there, but he shakes them off. And from what I've seen is more of a guy who has real confidence and command of how to throw into tight windows and to make the type of plays that you want to project to the NFL. It's just a matter of how fast can he process a more advanced offense.
Nate, you got some receivers you wanted to ask about.
Of course. I got to check up on my dynasty rookie drafts coming up. I'm in like 11 of those best ball dynasty drafts, and I love them. But I'm happy to hear from Matt, and happy to hear you're a big fan of Matt Corral, because it seems like the fantasy community is a lot higher on him than the draft community is for some reason. But anyway, let's get to these receivers. So the first guy I wanted to ask you about is Calvin Austin. Everyone has been talking about Calvin Austin since the Senior Bowl. They talk about his separation. That's a big buzzword, and separation can mean a lot of different things. But, the big concern for me was he came in at 5'7", 173 pounds. And, of course, all these college sites, they always list them way bigger and way taller. I mean, they think the world of their kids, so they always do that. But he was supposed to be closer, 5'9", 5'10", 185, 190. So does that size concern you? Because I'm kind of concerned about, maybe they only put him primarily in the slot, and then he can't play in the X, he can't play in the Z, he just kind of stays in one spot. So I know Rondale Moore was kind of a similar thing where they worry about him being a gadget player because he's so small. So I would love to hear your thoughts on Austin.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nate. And certainly, when you look at Moore, he was another 20 pounds heavier, and he's not small. He's just short. I mean, he's a big, thick, stocky receiver, kind of like, he makes Steve Smith look, Steve Smith was a strong player for his size, and he kind of dwarfs Steve Smith in that regard. But I think Moore would be more of a product of some of the issues that maybe the Cardinals have a less imaginative offense than people thought. And so I think there's still hope for him as a player. And we certainly saw some bright spots from him. With Austin, I would be a little bit concerned because there is a baseline of what you're looking for from a receiver. There's only been, when I think of the 2 players who were in the 170 to 178 range, probably for much of their careers, who were excellent receivers who could play outside and do well. Both of them played on the Commanders at one point in the past 15 years. One of them's Deshaun Jackson, who is just an exception to the rule. He's tough. He really has a good feel for, being able to play in traffic. And the other one was Paul Richardson, who's just a dog of a player who just couldn't stay healthy. But man, probably some of the most acrobatic catches you will ever see if you go back to his Seattle days. So both of those guys are big favorites of mine. But when you look at you look at Austin, I think you're right. He's got to be in the slot. He can give you big play skills from the slot, and occasionally you can put him outside, but it's going to have to be matchup based. It's going to have to be a schemes type of thing where it's going to be RPOs, or it's going to have to be something where they got a defense that they drew where they knew they can motion him outside, and now he's set up against a safety or a nickel corner, and that nickel corner is underwhelmed. Otherwise, Andy Isabella was a guy that got a lot of love at the Senior Bowl. And I used to kind of jokingly say that his nickname was Dance Fever, if you remember that old show. I know Doug does, so he and I are about the same age. But, you have guys who make tons of moves off the line, and when they have two-way goes in practice, which they do in these practice setups, the media gets really excited about them. Now, he did more than just win off multiple moves. He was efficient, and I think he's a good player. But, the shot of him becoming a third guy, a shot of that would be Tyler Lockett. If he can become a Tyler Lockett type of player, sure. But I think, again, I didn't see that level of skill in his game at the catch point to really say that he can hold up on that level.
Yeah, that makes plenty of sense. And when I think of Tyler Lockett, I think of another prospect, John Dotson from PSU. I think they're kind of similar players in some ways. But another guy I wanted to talk about, and I know you might roll your eyes at a few of the things I'm about to say, but I want to get your perspective on the film side. Okay. But from an analytical perspective, I mean, Sky Moore, he checks every box. He broke out as a freshman. He had over 1,200 yards as a sophomore. I mean, he outpaced Dwayne Eskridge, who was a second-round pick last year. So he's doing a lot of things right. He also led the country in missed forced tackles. So he's a guy who's going to check all those boxes. He's supposed to run, under a 4.4. So I'd love to hear your perspective from film though. What is his weakness? What besides level of competition? What can he work on? What do you see him as a pro?
Sure. And I think one of the things that he's going to have to work on, I mean, he's quick. He's very quick. He has good footwork. He can use his hands pretty well at the line of scrimmage. So I think that at least from the slot, he can play from the slot immediately as a big play slot option because of that ability to get yards after the catch. The big question for him is going to be really what all college players have to work on as slot options, which is, can he read the defenses in NFL to be on the same page with his quarterback? Because when you are a slot player, you're essentially the second quarterback on that offense, where you have to understand pre-snap and within your first 3 to 5 steps post-snap, whether you're seeing a zone, a hybrid zone, some sort of mix of man and zone in the field, and how to adjust to that in the same way that the quarterback wants you to adjust to it without having any words being spoken. So all the different combinations of where, there's some systems where you might have 5 different break possibilities based on what the coverage is doing. And at Western Michigan, much less even Alabama, you might only have 2, maybe 3. So I think that's going to be the biggest adjustment from, because again, as an outside player, when I watched him beat, cornerbacks like at Buffalo or teams like that, he showed plenty of burst. But when I watched him face, more of your top 20, top 25 teams, he seemed to get pushed to the boundary a fair bit. He kind of that Devonta Smith treatment that we saw a lot of teams were able to do against him, where he might get bullied to the boundary as an outside guy. So I think he's a guy that may need to sit a year or contribute for a year or two, unless he just shows he's a tremendously fast learner and he and his quarterback just connect unbelievably well. Because even a Hunter Renfrow, who is fantastic and one of the smartest football players, according to some of the people who talk about him, one of the smartest young receivers, it took him a couple years to really come into his own, and injuries for him to get the opportunity. And they're kind of, Renfro's a little smaller, but unbelievably quick and technically sound route runner. And I think Sky Moore's not as technically sound of a route runner, but certainly a better athlete. But he's not a bad route runner. So I like him. Don't love him as an immediate impact guy, but that's okay.
Okay. Taking notes. That's good to know for my drafts coming up. Okay, one other guy, Drake London. What do you see like as his most highly translatable traits going to the NFL? And then what areas does he need to work on? He reminds me a little bit of like a mix between two former teammates in Alshon Jeffrey and Brandon Marshall, because he's got that big body, but he has the big body, but he also can create that separation. He also, he's pretty violent at the catch point. I mean, I like to watch him a lot, but I feel like fantasy community is a little lower on him than they should be.
Well, the fantasy community is kind of like GMs and owners gone wrong. And we have some of those in the NFL, as we know, who think they're playing fantasy. And I joke that speed is kind of like the cleavage of the NFL. It's one of those things that in the appropriate setting, it's nice to look at. Everyone's happy with, when people are consenting about it, fine, that's great. But at the same time, you don't sit down and choose cleavage as the reason to have a life partner, and the same thing when you're choosing speed over a player, that's one of those situations where teams go, well, he can't run routes well. He doesn't separate well. He doesn't track the ball very well over his shoulder, but boy, he's fast. We can coach him up. And they don't coach anybody up in the NFL. We know this already. Players have to work at it on their own. So when a Sammy Coates gets drafted early, because I just described him pretty much, it's because of speed. And so they get excited about guys like that. I think London's fast enough. He meets the baselines that he can get deep on you. I think he has good separation skills. He's certainly physical enough. I think the combination of guys you mentioned is a very good one. I would say he's a better version of Michael Pittman. He's more versatile than what Michael Pittman offered. And Michael Pittman has done well in his system. I think that London has to work on dropping his weight just a little bit more, because certain breaks that require certain hard breaks on like dig routes and comebacks where he can really use double moves on people have to set up with him being able to run the comeback and the hitch and the curl, where he can really sit in that chair at the top of his stem, come to a sudden stop. He shows that he has the bend, but he doesn't quite get there as low as he should. And I've seen him do it. It's just not consistent. So it's just a matter of him really focusing on that area. But what he does really well, like you said, catch point, he is tough. He's gonna, you can put a licking on that guy at the catch point, and he's not dropping that ball too often. He's someone that's going to break tackles. He's going to push through people. He has enough burst to be able to get angles on people so that when they do try to make contact with them, it's not a direct hit, which just aids him in more in favor anyhow. So for him, does he come into the league and necessarily become the primary guy right away? Probably not. But can he give you some of what Michael Williams is giving in for the Chargers, and kind of have that trajectory, and then maybe more upside than what Michael Williams has? Yeah, I think so. I think he's that good.
Before we switch to running backs, I'm curious your thoughts on George Pickens.
Well, listen, a lot of people would joke that I'm biased because I worked at the University of Georgia for 10 years, but that aside, I think he could be the best receiver out of this class if he stays healthy. He has all the physical tools you're looking for, obviously. He also has that physical mentality of how to play the game as a blocker, as a route runner. He adjusts extremely well to the ball, very bendy, someone who has the opportunity to be that kind of alpha receiver that you're looking for. So there's a few guys in this class are really good, but I think he'll get downgraded due to the ACL, and there are going to be some teams that wish they hadn't.
I did not know that. I'm full disclosure, I'm a UGA homer. My grandparents lived in Athens. We went there every year, so I did not know that. But
I lived there 25 years.
It's wonderful, Athens. I love Athens. So let's transition to two more dogs then as we go to the running backs. Zamir White's a kind of guy that you want on your team, not necessarily the back I think that the NFL is looking for. To me, the talent evaluators in the NFL have to be salivating over what James Cook does, particularly since he's put on the weight since he's been in Athens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have those guys ranked pretty close together, just different styles of player.
Reminds me a bit of Sony and Chubb coming out, right? I mean, differently.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And that's a very good point with those two players. And Chubb was my top running back in that class, by the way. I had him just slightly ahead of Saquon Barkley, just because he was a better decision maker. And I know that was an unpopular opinion back then, but I don't think it's one now. So when, or at least it's gotten its respect, I'll put it that way. When you take a look at Zamir White, he doesn't have that Chubb electricity to his game. He's not going to teleport in 5 yards and wonder what happened. But he is quick enough to play in the league. He has that burst. He certainly attacks downhill hard. I think he does a number of things well where he can be that change of pace player that you can put in the red zone. You can put him in green zone situations, short yardage situations, and you can use him as kind of a guy to spell your starter with and get quality production out of him. I just don't think he's ever going to be a superstar or a 1,300-yard back unless, he winds up in a Chester Taylor behind the great offensive line that they had pre-Adrian Peterson, for a year. And then, that's it for him. But James Cook is fascinating because he has a little Chris Johnson to him in the sense that he has that, he has that unbelievable burst and speed, maybe not to the level of Johnson, but he's very quick. He has that curvy linear movement to kind of like a motorcycle bending around a track where he doesn't lose much speed, working around defenders like that, like his brother Dalvin. Dalvin's great at that. But the difference between he and Dalvin are that Dalvin is more powerful, has better contact balance between the tackles, whereas Cook actually can cut. Dalvin Cook does this thing where if you think of pistons on an engine, when he's the only guy I see do this, but he can change direction where his feet never stop moving, but he's like pivoting like this as he makes a change of direction, and it works for him wonderfully, But it's like Dalvin Cook got the banger side of the running back equation that his brother lacks, but James has the cutting ability, but both of them can weave around in tight space and set up tight space as well. James Cook has grown on me as a back that I could see him sneaking into a team where there's a really good fit for him and him being the lead back and growing into that role. And you get 3 to 4 seasons of him where you're just like, wow, this guy's a really bona fide starter with, maybe 1,400 total yards of offense, giving you kind of like an electric Austin Eckler kind of, version of a player who gives you more of that top end speed, but gives you some of that versatility that Eckler has. Maybe not the toughness, but he's certainly a good one.
Nate, you had a couple other running backs, right?
Yeah. So I was curious your thoughts, the consensus top 3. I know you have your own grades and you don't really worry about the consensus, which I love, that's great. But for fantasy and everything, I got to know for, contact balance, how would you rank the top 3 backs? And the top 3 backs, of course, Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, and of course our guy, Isaiah Spiller. So contact balance. And then also I wanted to know about like their vision, because I know those are 2 things that's a big point of emphasis when you talk on your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that from a contact balance perspective, it's going to be Hall, Walker, and Spiller in that order. And I would probably put Hall and Walker a good tier above Spiller in this regard. The main thing about Spiller is that he needs to learn how to align his pads better in 2 ways, upper and lower body. When you attack someone with your pads, make sure that your hips are downhill. If you're going to lean with one pad and your hips are headed towards the sideline, a cornerback's going to basically push you backwards. And that's what happens with him in those situations. And, a guy like Darren McFadden was an example of that, where that didn't work out well for him because of that. So he's got to figure that out. When he gets downhill, he's got some pop to him. That's for sure. Very elusive. But also his pad level gets too low, where he brings his pads down, but his head drops. And every running back coach I've ever had a chance to talk to, or even former running backs talk to, they talk about, you drop your head, your back curves in such a way that the minute you make contact, you fall straight to the ground where you were. So that's something those are two things he's really got to work at. Breece Hall, no problem with contact balance, no problem with pad level. Kenneth Walker, same thing. Both guys, I think are very good in that respect. They may not be the best at it in this class, but they're contributor or starter worthy, and that's enough to be a starter in the league. And vision, I would say Kenneth Walker is the most disciplined and the best overall decision maker. Breece Hall makes it look the easiest. And I think he has moments of inspired decisions. I don't think he has too many flaws with his decision making either. But I think that Walker's maybe slightly more sophisticated, but Hall's footwork and quickness might make him look better than Walker in that regard, because that footwork kind of bleeds into how the action behind the processing of information. Spiller's third. Spiller's a guy who, I think he can be a good player with toss plays, with certain outside zone plays. But then when you ask him to run certain gap plays or zone plays inside, he can be prone to bouncing things outside, where he really must learn to set things up. Like counter is not a common play anymore, though it was, I'm talking to two fans who know it's the most heralded play in the history of that franchise. But you all knew I'm glad we're having this conversation now, because you guys understand this better than anybody who listens probably does. When you run counter, and I'm sure most fans could teach me about counter who are Washington fans, but when you run counter and you have penetration to the outside or a tight crease inside, and that force player outside has gotten depth into the line, you don't try and bounce around him. You try and take it where your puller is going. And repeatedly against Auburn, against Alabama, a couple other teams I've seen where, Spiller has the tight crease. At worst, he should press a little further towards that force man and then cut it back inside the blocker who's got that force man and take advantage of that leverage to the inside. He doesn't do that. He tries to bounce things outside. He's very elusive. He's worked on his footwork for years, since high school. I know the guy who's worked with him, and I know that he's had his high school players kind of take notes on some of the work I put out on YouTube and things like that. So he's fantastic with his footwork, but knowing how to apply it within the context of his running scheme, he has to get better at. And when you are bouncing outside counter, as my buddy Jay Moyer, who used to write for me, who's at FF Astronauts and a running game coach in high school for over 20 years, he'll tell you that's a very fundamental thing that most guys who run counter already know this. So if he's doing that right now, it's kind of an egregious thing he has to fix.
I'm curious, while we've got you, Matt, what your thoughts on were John Bates, the tight end from last year, kind of where you saw him going, because I think Washington was pretty excited about what they got from him last year.
Yeah, the Boise State guy.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, he was fun. He trained with Travis Kelce for a bit of time, prior to his senior year, I believe. He's an overall good combo player. One of those guys, and Washington seems to pick those guys. Like whether for fantasy, Jeremy Sprinkle may not have ever been anything, but the guy could block. He could usually catch pretty well. He could get open in certain looks. And I think that Bates is kind of in that mold. He blocks well. He's a good zone route runner. He's someone that's going to be able to get open for you off of play action and stretch the field. If he gets a little bit more athletic, maybe he can become a little bit more of what I call matchup player who can win one-on-one against even, quality defenders, who play man to man. And if that happens, suddenly you've got something that you're signing him to an extension. But I think he's a guy that if you need him, he can contribute and deliver in the run and the pass game, at least within the first 20 to 25 yards down the field against zone.
Matt, thank you so much for doing this today. Could have done it all day. Had a great time. The scouting portfolio pre-register, right? When does it release?
Yep, every year, April 1. Hopefully that'll be the same for the year 17. So,
absolutely. Thank you so much for doing this today.
Hey, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Nate, we'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks.
Take it easy, fellas.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt. All right. Have a good one.
All right. See you, Nate.